The Galactic Military Academy floated in space like a massive silver coin, its surface covered with lights that twinkled against the darkness. Inside the station, alien cadets from dozens of worlds trained together, learning the art of war from the best teachers in the galaxy. The Academy was famous throughout known space for one simple reason. It taught combat techniques from every major species in the Federation. Commandant Zex-9 stood at his office window, watching ships dock at the station's ports. His 6 arms moved in a pattern that showed excitement among his people, the Kalari. Today was special. After months of paperwork and negotiations, the humans were finally sending their first military instructors to the Academy. As the newest members of the Galactic Federation, Earth had earned this honor by successfully defending their colonies from Krillian raiders just 2 years earlier. The human transport ship looked crude compared to the sleek vessels of other species. It was basically a metal box with engines attached, painted in dull gray. But Zex-9 knew better than to judge by appearances. Those ugly human ships had beaten the Krillians in battle after battle, using tactics that still puzzled military analysts across the galaxy. Captain Jake Morrison stepped off the transport first, followed closely by Lieutenant Amy Carter. Both humans wore simple green uniforms with minimal decoration. Morrison was tall and lean, with short brown hair and steady blue eyes. Carter was shorter but carried herself with the same quiet confidence. Neither looked particularly impressive compared to the towering Zenthari warriors or the armored Vorthon soldiers already teaching at the Academy. Zex-9 greeted them personally, which was unusual. Most new instructors met with junior staff first, but humans were different. They represented something new and unknown in galactic warfare, and the Commandant wanted to understand them better. "Welcome to the Academy," Zex-9 said in careful English. "We are eager to learn from your species' military experience." Morrison smiled politely. "Thank you, Commandant. We're honored to be here. Your people's recent victories against the Krillians were most impressive," Zex-9 continued. "The Federation Council was quite surprised by your tactics." Carter nodded. "We've had a lot of practice fighting against bad odds. Earth's history taught us to be creative." The Commandant assigned them quarters near the other faculty members and gave them a tour of the Academy's facilities. The humans seemed interested in everything, asking questions about training methods, student backgrounds, and Academy traditions. They were polite and professional, exactly what Zex-9 had hoped for. The next day, Morrison began teaching his first class on human infantry tactics. His students included 6 different alien species, all eager to learn what made human ground forces so effective. The classroom was standard Academy design. Holographic projectors could create any battlefield scenario, while individual workstations let students practice tactics in simulation. "Before we start," Morrison said, "I want you to forget everything you know about ground combat." The students looked confused. Cadet Tis, a methodical Vorthon known for his perfect adherence to military doctrine, raised a tentacle-like arm. "Sir, should we not build upon established foundations?" Morrison shook his head. "Human tactics work differently. We don't follow established patterns because our enemies expect those patterns. The moment you become predictable, you're dead." He activated the holographic display, showing a barren hillside with scattered rocks. "Standard Federation doctrine says you take the high ground and establish defensive positions. Who can tell me why that's wrong?" The question shocked the cadets. Taking high ground was basic military science, taught to every species in the galaxy. It provided better visibility, clear fields of fire, and defensive advantage. A Zenthari student named Velkath spoke up. "Sir, high ground has been proven effective for over 3,000 years of galactic warfare." "Exactly," Morrison replied. 3,000 years. Every enemy commander knows you'll go for the high ground. So what do you think they'll do?" The class fell silent. This kind of thinking went against everything they'd learned. Meanwhile, Carter was teaching her first naval strategy course to senior cadets. The Academy's main lecture hall could hold over 200 students, and word had spread quickly about the human instructors. Carter found herself facing a full audience, including several faculty members who had come to observe. She began with human naval history, projecting images of ancient Earth warships made of wood and metal. The alien students seemed amused by the primitive technology until Carter started describing the battles these ships fought. The Battle of Trafalgar involved over 60 ships firing chemical, Explosives at each other from close range, she explained. Both sides knew that many vessels would be destroyed completely along with their crews, yet they continued fighting for hours. Glow of Dawn, a crystalline Nexari student, made a sound like wind chimes. Instructor Carter, why did they not negotiate surrender when casualties became heavy? Carter paused. Because surrender meant their nation would be destroyed. When humans fight, we're not just fighting for military objectives. We're fighting for our right to exist. The concept seemed alien to her audience, literally. Most galactic species had evolved beyond such desperate warfare. Conflicts were resolved through limited engagements with agreed-upon rules and reasonable casualty limits. As days turned to weeks, both human instructors noticed changes in their students. The cadets started asking unusual questions and suggesting modifications to standard tactics. During simulation exercises, they began taking risks that their previous instructors would have discouraged. Cadet Theiss, normally rigid in his adherence to Vorthon military doctrine, started experimenting with unpredictable movement patterns. When his squad leader criticized him for breaking formation, Theiss replied, "Captain Morrison says the enemy cannot hit what they cannot predict." In Carter's classes, students began studying historical battles with an intensity that surprised other faculty members. They were particularly fascinated by instances where smaller human forces had defeated larger enemies through unconventional tactics. The other instructors started to notice these changes too. Master Veltar, the senior Zenthari combat instructor, complained to Zex-9 that his students were questioning techniques that had been perfected over centuries. "They ask why we follow traditional sword forms," Veltar said during a faculty meeting. "They want to know why we cannot simply attack vital points directly instead of following proper technique." Instructor Korth 9, who taught Vorthon defensive tactics, had similar concerns. "My students no longer respect the concept of measured response. They want to know how to disable enemies permanently, rather than forcing them to withdraw." Zex-9 listened to these complaints with growing interest, rather than concern. The human instructors were clearly having an effect on the student body, but the results seemed positive. Test scores were improving, and cadets showed increased motivation and creativity in their exercises. What the commandant didn't realize was that the changes went deeper than improved performance. The alien cadets were beginning to think like humans about warfare, not as a limited contest between opposing forces, but as a struggle for survival where anything was acceptable if it led to victory. The transformation was subtle but profound, and it would soon become impossible to ignore. The Academy's training center buzzed with activity as cadets prepared for their weekly combat exercise. Today's scenario was straightforward: assault a space station held by enemy forces, secure key objectives, and minimize casualties. It was a classic Federation training exercise that every cadet had practiced dozens of times. Cadet Theiss adjusted his Vorthon combat harness and reviewed the mission briefing one more time. As squad leader, he was responsible for getting his mixed species team through the exercise safely and efficiently. The standard approach was simple: advance through the main corridors, establish fire positions at junction points, and methodically clear each section until reaching the command center. But as Theiss studied the station layout, he remembered something Captain Morrison had said in class. "Your enemy expects you to do the obvious thing, so don't do it." When the exercise began, Theiss led his squad past the main entrance entirely. Instead, he guided them to a maintenance hatch that led into the station's ventilation system. His teammates looked confused as he started removing the heavy metal grate. "Sir," whispered Cadet Zorvel, a traditional Zenthari warrior, "this is not the designated entry point." Theiss paused in his work. "That's exactly why we're using it." The squad crawled through the narrow air ducts, their equipment clanking softly against the metal walls. It was uncomfortable and undignified, nothing like the clean, organized assault they had practiced. But it got them deep into the station without triggering a single sensor. They emerged in the station's engineering section, far behind enemy lines. The opposing force, made up of senior cadets, had positioned themselves to defend against a frontal assault through the main corridors. They never expected anyone to appear in their rear areas. Theiss split his squad into two groups. Instead of heading directly for the command center, they attacked the station's power systems and communication arrays first. Within minutes, the defending force found themselves fighting in darkness without coordination between their units. The exercise ended in record time, with Theis's squad achieving total victory while suffering 0 casualties. But when the instructors reviewed the exercise recordings, reactions were mixed. "Clever work," Morrison told the assembled cadets. "You adapted to the situation and used your enemy's expectations against them." Master Veltar looked less pleased. "The ventilation system was not part of the approved exercise parameters," he said stiffly. "Proper military conduct requires following established protocols." Theis looked confused by the criticism. "Sir, the objective was to capture the station. We captured it by cheating," Veltar replied. Morrison stepped forward. "With respect, Master Veltar, there's no cheating in warfare. There's only winning and losing." The exchange highlighted a growing tension at the Academy. Traditional alien instructors emphasized honor, proper technique, and following established procedures. The humans taught their students to abandon these concepts when survival was at stake. Lieutenant Carter's naval strategy classes were causing similar disruptions. Her lectures on human maritime history fascinated the cadets but disturbed the faculty. She had been describing the Battle of Midway, where American forces had used code-breaking and deception to defeat a larger Japanese fleet. The Americans knew they were outnumbered and outgunned, Carter explained to her audience. So they refused to fight the battle their enemies wanted. Instead, they lured the Japanese fleet into a trap and attacked when the enemy was most vulnerable. Cadet Glow of Dawn raised a crystalline appendage. "Instructor Carter, did the Americans not offer their enemies a chance to surrender with honor?" Carter shook her head. "In that situation, honor was a luxury they couldn't afford. The survival of their nation was at stake." "But what about the rules of civilized warfare?" asked another student. "Humans have a saying," Carter replied. "All's fair in love and war. When our existence is threatened, we use whatever methods are necessary to survive." The alien students struggled with this concept. For thousands of years, galactic warfare had been conducted according to agreed-upon rules that limited destruction and preserved the dignity of both sides. The idea of abandoning these rules seemed barbaric. Yet Carter's tactical principles were undeniably effective. During simulation exercises, students who applied human naval strategies consistently outperformed those using traditional Federation tactics. They learned to use deception, concentrate force at enemy weak points, and exploit technological advantages ruthlessly. The changes in student behavior were becoming more noticeable throughout the Academy. Cadets who had trained under human instructors developed a different attitude toward combat exercises. They took calculated risks that previous generations would have avoided. They questioned orders that seemed tactically unsound. Most disturbing to traditional faculty, they showed little concern for fighting with honor when victory was possible through other means. During a routine sparring session, a Xanthari cadet named Kethmore shocked his instructor by abandoning proper sword forms entirely. Instead of engaging in the ritualized combat style his people had perfected over millennia, he grabbed sand from the training ground and threw it in his opponent's eyes before attacking. "Disgraceful," Master Veltar declared, stopping the match immediately. "You have dishonored both yourself and your opponent." Kethmore looked genuinely confused. "Sir, I won the match. Victory without honor is meaningless," Veltar replied. "Captain Morrison says victory is the only thing that matters when lives are at stake," Kethmore countered. The argument that followed drew attention from across the Academy. Traditional instructors were horrified by what they saw as the corruption of military values. Human instructors defended their teaching methods as practical and effective. Students found themselves caught between competing philosophies of warfare. Commandant Zex-9 watched these developments with growing concern. The Academy had always prided itself on maintaining high standards of military conduct alongside tactical excellence. The human instructors weren't technically violating any regulations, but they were fundamentally changing how students thought about combat. The situation came to a head during Morrison's Advanced Infantry Tactics course. He was teaching the cadets about human military history, specifically focusing on battles where humans had overcome impossible odds through determination and unconventional thinking. At the Battle of Thermopylae, Morrison explained, 300 Spartan warriors held off an army of hundreds of thousands for 3 days. They knew they were going to die, but they fought anyway because their sacrifice would inspire others to resist. A Vorthon student raised a tentacle, "Sir, why did they not retreat when the situation became hopeless?" Morrison paused, considering his answer carefully. "Because sometimes fighting and dying for what you believe in is more important than living in defeat." The alien students sat in stunned silence. The concept of choosing certain death over retreat violated every survival instinct their species possessed. Yet the humans had built their entire military tradition around such sacrifices. "The key to understanding human warfare," Morrison continued, "is that we don't fight battles to win territory or achieve limited objectives. We fight to ensure our way of life continues to exist. Every engagement is treated as if the survival of our species depends on the outcome." After class, several alien cadets approached their traditional instructors with disturbing questions. They wanted to know why Federation doctrine emphasized preserving lives over achieving victory. They questioned whether showing mercy to enemies was tactically sound. Most troubling, they began to suggest that perhaps the old ways of conducting warfare were too gentle for the realities of modern conflict. The alien faculty members found themselves unable to provide satisfying answers to these questions. Their military traditions had evolved during an era of limited conflicts between civilized species who shared common values about the conduct of war. They had never encountered an enemy that fought with the desperate intensity that humans brought to every battle. As the semester progressed, it became clear that the human instructors weren't just teaching tactics and strategy. They were transmitting a completely different philosophy of warfare, one based on the assumption that every fight was a fight for survival, and that any method that ensured victory was not only acceptable but morally necessary. The transformation was irreversible. Students who had learned to think like humans about combat couldn't simply forget those lessons. They had been exposed to a form of warfare that was more effective than anything they had previously encountered, but also more dangerous to both themselves and their enemies. The Academy faced a crisis it had never anticipated. Its own students were becoming too dangerous to control. The Academy's main training arena had been transformed for the special demonstration. Elevated viewing platforms surrounded a large combat zone equipped with holographic projectors and sensor arrays. Today, the Academy would showcase its diverse training methods to a group of distinguished visitors. From across the Federation, Admiral Kent of the Federation Defense Council sat in the center of the main viewing platform, flanked by military observers from a dozen different worlds. This was an important day for the Academy, a chance to prove that their mixed species approach to military education was producing superior officers for the Federation. Fleet Commandant Zex-9 stood before the assembled dignitaries, his 6 arms moving in patterns that showed pride and confidence. "Honored guests, today you will witness the finest military training methods from across known space. Each demonstration represents centuries of tactical development by the galaxy's most successful warrior cultures." The first demonstration began with the Zenthari Blade Masters. 6 warriors moved onto the arena floor, their movements flowing like water as they performed traditional sword forms. Their technique was flawless, each strike and parry executed with precision that spoke of lifetimes spent perfecting their art. The visitors nodded approvingly as the Zenthari demonstrated their ability to fight multiple opponents while maintaining perfect form. Next came the Vorthan defensive specialists. They formed a shield wall that seemed impenetrable, their overlapping energy barriers creating a fortress of light that could withstand the heaviest weapons fire. Their coordinated movements showed the discipline that had made Vorthan armies unbeatable in defensive warfare for over 1,000 years. The Nexari energy manipulation demonstration was equally impressive. The crystalline beings coordinated their attacks across multiple platforms, their energy beams converging and splitting in complex patterns that could destroy entire fleets. Their mathematical precision in battle was something other species could study, but never truly replicate. Each demonstration followed the same pattern, ancient techniques perfected over millennia, performed with flawless execution according to time-tested doctrines. The visiting dignitaries were suitably impressed by the Academy's ability to preserve and teach these traditional methods. Then, it was time for the human demonstration. Captain Morrison and Lieutenant Carter entered the arena with a group of volunteer cadets from various species. Unlike the previous demonstrations, they carried no ceremonial weapons or wore no traditional armor. The human instructors looked almost casual compared to the formal presentations that had preceded them. "Honored visitors," Morrison announced. "We won't be demonstrating traditional human techniques today. Instead, we'd like to show you how humans approach military problems through a live training exercise." The arena's holographic systems activated, creating a detailed simulation of a Federation outpost under siege. The scenario was complex. A small defending force had to hold critical installations against a much larger attacking army. Conventional wisdom said the defenders should establish prepared positions and fight a delaying action until reinforcements arrived. Morrison turned to his mixed group of cadets. "Your mission is simple. Defend this facility against overwhelming odds. Use whatever methods you think will work." What happened next left the distinguished visitors speechless. The cadet team immediately abandoned the defensive positions that had been prepared for them. Instead of forming a static defense, they split into small groups and began moving through the simulated facility like they owned it. They weren't defending positions, they were using the entire complex as a weapon. Cadet This led one group through the facility's maintenance areas, setting improvised traps using cleaning supplies and spare parts. When the attacking force tried to advance through what should have been safe corridors, they walked into explosions that turned narrow passages into killing zones. Meanwhile, Kethmore had taken another group to the facility's power plant. Instead of defending it, they rigged it to overload at will. When enemy forces concentrated their attack on what they thought was a critical target, the cadets triggered a controlled explosion that eliminated the entire assault force. The most shocking moment came when the simulation generated casualties among the defending team. In every previous demonstration, wounded participants had been evacuated from the combat zone according to standard Federation protocols. But the human-trained cadets did something different. Instead of pulling their wounded comrades to safety, they incorporated them into defensive positions. The injured cadets continued fighting from fixed positions, providing covering fire while mobile units repositioned for counterattacks. They fought harder after being wounded, not less. Admiral Kent leaned forward in his seat. "Are those cadets continuing to fight despite being classified as casualties?" Zex-9 checked his instruments. "According to the simulation parameters, yes. They should have been evacuated for medical treatment. But they're still engaging enemy forces," observed Commander Yith, a Vorthon officer. "This violates basic Federation military doctrine." The exercise continued to escalate beyond anything the visitors had seen before. When the attacking simulation force adapted to the cadets' trap tactics, the defending team immediately changed their approach. They abandoned their prepared positions entirely and launched a coordinated assault directly into the heart of the enemy formation. "They're counterattacking," Admiral Kent said in disbelief. "With less than half their original strength surrounded and outnumbered, they're launching an offensive?" Morrison nodded grimly. "In human military doctrine, the best defense is often a good offense." The counterattack was tactically insane by every measure of conventional warfare. The cadet team, reduced to 8 effective fighters, charged directly into an enemy force of over 40 simulated opponents. They concentrated their entire remaining strength against what they had identified as the enemy command structure. It worked. The simulation ended with the complete destruction of the attacking force and the successful defense of the facility. The method of victory shocked the observers more than the victory itself. The cadets had won by eliminating their enemy's ability to fight as an organized force, then systematically destroying the scattered remnants. The arena fell silent as the holographic displays faded. The visiting dignitaries sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they had witnessed. This wasn't warfare as they understood it. It was something far more desperate and dangerous. Admiral Kent was the first to speak. "Captain Morrison, that was the most disturbing military demonstration I have ever witnessed. Those cadets fought like their lives depended on victory." Morrison met the Admiral's gaze steadily. "That's because in human military doctrine they do." Commander Yith made a sound of distress. "But the casualties, the disregard for proper procedures, the abandonment of defensive positions, none of this follows accepted military practice." Carter stepped forward. "Commander, accepted military practice assumes both sides are fighting for limited objectives under agreed-upon rules. Humans fight under the assumption that defeat means extinction. But surely such methods would result in massive casualties in real combat." asked another observer. Morrison nodded. Often, yes. But human history has taught us that massive casualties are preferable to total defeat. The implications of this statement settled over the viewing platform like a dark cloud. These humans weren't just teaching different tactics. They represented a completely different understanding of what warfare meant. Where other species saw combat as a tool of policy, humans saw it as a struggle for survival. Glow of Dawn, the Nixari representative, made a sound like breaking crystal. Captain Morrison, are you saying that humans are psychologically incapable of fighting limited conflicts? Morrison considered the question carefully. We're capable of it, but we don't trust it. Every human military engagement is planned and executed as if our entire civilization's survival depends on the outcome. The visiting dignitaries exchanged troubled glances. They had come to the Academy expecting to see refined demonstrations of military skill. Instead, they had witnessed something that challenged their fundamental assumptions about the nature of warfare itself. Admiral Kent stood slowly, his expression grave. Commandant Zex-9, I believe we need to discuss the implications of what we've seen here today. The demonstration had achieved something no one expected. It had shown that human methods were devastatingly effective, but it had also revealed why those methods were too dangerous to be widely taught. The humans didn't just train soldiers. They created warriors who would fight to the death for any cause they believed in. As the visitors filed out of the arena, their conversations were subdued and worried. They had seen the future of warfare, and it frightened them more than any enemy they had ever faced. The Academy faculty meeting room had never seen such heated discussion. Around the circular table, instructors from dozens of worlds argued in voices that ranged from whispers to roars, depending on their species' vocal capabilities. The demonstration 3 days earlier had shattered the Academy's normally peaceful atmosphere. Master Veltar slammed his ceremonial blade on the table, the sound echoing through the chamber. These humans corrupt our students with their barbaric methods, he declared, his voice carrying the formal cadence of ancient Zenthari war councils. They teach warfare without honor, combat without dignity. My cadets no longer respect the traditional forms that have served our people for 3,000 years. Instructor Korth 9's tentacles writhed in patterns that showed deep distress among the Vorthon people. My defensive tactics courses have become chaos. Students question why we preserve enemy lives when we could eliminate threats permanently. They want to know why we allow defeated enemies to retreat and regroup. Commandant Zex-9 listened to the complaints with growing concern. The human instructors sat quietly at one end of the table, their expressions unreadable. Admiral Kent, who had remained at the Academy following the demonstration, observed the proceedings with the cold attention of a military investigator. The changes in student behavior are becoming dangerous, continued Master Veltar. During yesterday's sword practice, Cadet Kethmore abandoned all proper technique. He grabbed sand and threw it in his opponent's eyes, then struck while his partner was blinded. When I corrected him, he claimed that Captain Morrison had taught him that victory justified any method. Morrison spoke for the first time. Master Veltar, in actual combat, your opponent won't be following proper technique either. We teach our students to survive real battles, not to perform in ceremonial duels. You teach them to fight like animals, Veltar replied coldly. We teach them to fight like humans, Carter interjected. There's a difference. The tension in the room increased as other instructors shared similar concerns. Professor With-6, who taught Nixari energy coordination, reported that his students were now trying to concentrate all their power on single targets, instead of the traditional distributed approach that had proven effective for centuries. They claim that destroying one enemy completely is better than wounding many enemies partially, he said, his crystalline voice carrying notes of confusion. This goes against every principle of civilized energy warfare. Admiral Kent cleared his throat. Perhaps we could resolve this debate with a practical demonstration. I suggest a war game between traditionally trained students and those who have studied under human instruction. Zex-9 hesitated. Admiral, such exercises could become quite intense given the current tensions. That's exactly why we need to conduct one, Kent replied. We need to understand what we're dealing with. The war game was scheduled for the following day. The scenario was standard: urban combat simulation with clear objectives and established rules of engagement. A traditionally trained Xanthari unit would face a mixed-species team that had studied under the human instructors. Captain Morrison was asked to observe, but not participate. The Academy administration wanted to see what their students would do without direct human guidance. The simulation began at dawn in the Academy's largest training facility. The urban environment was complex, a mock city with residential areas, commercial districts, and industrial zones. Both teams had studied the terrain extensively and prepared their strategies according to their training. The Xanthari unit, led by Cadet Zorvel, deployed according to classical Federation doctrine. They established clear lines of advance, maintained proper formation intervals, and moved methodically toward their objectives. Their plan was textbook perfect. A coordinated assault that would capture key positions while minimizing casualties on both sides. The human-trained team, commanded by Cadet Theiss, did something completely different. Instead of advancing toward their assigned objectives, they immediately split into small groups and disappeared into the urban landscape. The Xanthari force found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to engage in conventional battle. Theiss's team had studied the simulation parameters more carefully than anyone realized. They knew that the Xanthari would follow predictable movement patterns based on their training. So instead of defending assigned positions, the human-trained cadets went hunting. They attacked the Xanthari unit's communication centers first, using improvised explosives to destroy equipment that should have been protected by conventional defenses. When Zorvel tried to coordinate his forces using backup systems, he found that those had been sabotaged as well. "Sir," reported one of his squad leaders during a brief moment of restored communication, "the enemy isn't where our intelligence said they would be. They're everywhere except where they're supposed to be." The situation deteriorated rapidly for the traditional force. Every time they tried to establish defensive positions, the human-trained team attacked from unexpected directions. When they attempted to retreat and regroup, they found their escape routes already compromised. Most disturbing was the enemy's treatment of casualties. In previous war games, wounded participants were evacuated according to Federation protocols, allowing both sides to maintain their fighting strength within reasonable limits. But the human-trained team treated casualties differently. When Xanthari wounded tried to withdraw from combat, the opposing team followed them. They didn't capture prisoners or allow dignified retreat. They pursued damaged units until those units were completely eliminated from the exercise. "They're hunting our wounded," Zorvel reported in growing panic. "This isn't warfare, it's extermination." The war game, planned to last 6 hours, ended in 43 minutes with the complete collapse of the Xanthari force. But the speed of victory wasn't the most shocking aspect of the exercise. Admiral Kent studied the battle recordings with growing alarm. "They didn't fight to defeat the enemy," he observed. "They fought to eliminate the enemy's ability to fight back." Morrison, watching the analysis, nodded grimly. "That's correct, Admiral. In human military doctrine, defeating an enemy and destroying an enemy are the same thing." The post-exercise debriefing was more disturbing than the battle itself. Zorvel, normally composed and confident, was visibly shaken as he described the experience. "They didn't fight us," he told the assembled faculty. "They fought our ability to fight. When we tried to retreat and reorganize, they followed us. When we attempted to establish new defensive positions, they were already there waiting. It was as if they weren't trying to defeat us in battle, but to ensure we could never battle again." Cadet Theiss, asked to explain his team's tactics, seemed confused by the criticism. "Sir, our objective was to win the exercise. We won. By violating every principle of civilized warfare," Master Veltar replied angrily. Theiss looked genuinely puzzled. "Sir, Captain Morrison taught us that there are no principles in warfare except victory and defeat. Everything else is just ceremony." The room fell silent. These weren't human instructors speaking. These were alien cadets who had learned to think like humans about combat. They had internalized concepts that their own species found psychologically disturbing. Admiral Kent called for an emergency session with just the senior faculty and human instructors. The discussion that followed would determine the future of human involvement in Federation military education. "Captain Morrison, Lieutenant Carter," the Admiral began, "we need to understand something fundamental. Are you teaching these students tactics and strategies, or are you teaching them to think like humans?" Morrison considered the question carefully. "Admiral, you can't separate human tactics from human thinking. Our methods work because of how we approach the concept of warfare itself. And how is that different from other species? Carter answered. Other species fight wars to achieve political objectives. Humans fight wars to survive. Every battle we've ever fought has been conducted with the understanding that defeat could mean the extinction of our way of life. But surely that's an exaggeration, protested Instructor. Korth 9 Morrison shook his head. Human history is full of conflicts where the losing side was completely destroyed. Their cities burned, their populations scattered, their cultures eliminated. We learned to fight as if every enemy victory could be our last defeat. The implications settled over the room like a heavy weight. The humans weren't just teaching different methods. They were transmitting a completely different relationship with violence itself. Admiral Kent stood slowly. I think we've learned enough. This session is classified at the highest levels. The meeting ended with everyone understanding that something fundamental had changed. The Academy had created something it couldn't control. Alien students who fought with human desperation but lacked human restraint. The next day, official orders would arrive that would change everything. The emergency meeting in Commandant Zex-9's office felt more like a military tribunal than a faculty discussion. Admiral Kent sat at the head of the table, flanked by senior officers from the Federation Defense Council who had arrived on fast courier ships overnight. The human instructors faced them across the polished surface, while other Academy faculty filled the remaining chairs. The morning light streaming through the office's large viewport seemed harsh and unforgiving. Outside, normal Academy operations continued, but inside this room, the future of human involvement in Federation military education hung in the balance. Admiral Kent opened the proceedings with formal military precision. Captain Morrison, Lieutenant Carter, this council has reviewed the events of recent days with growing concern. The demonstration 3 days ago, followed by yesterday's war, game, has raised serious questions about the compatibility of human military doctrine with Federation standards. Morrison straightened in his chair. Admiral, our teaching methods have been effective. Student performance in all measurable categories has improved significantly. That's precisely the problem, Admiral Kent replied. Your methods are too effective. The changes in cadet behavior have become a source of institutional concern. Master Veltar leaned forward, his ceremonial blade resting across the table. These humans have corrupted our finest students. Cadet Kethmore, who was once a model of Zenthari military virtue, now fights without honor or dignity. He cares only for victory, regardless of the cost. And Cadet Thys, added Instructor Korth 9, has abandoned every principle of Vorthon defensive doctrine. He no longer thinks in terms of protecting lives, only of eliminating enemies. Carter spoke up. With respect, these cadets are learning to adapt to real combat situations. The enemy won't follow your ceremonial rules when lives are at stake. But that's exactly the issue, Admiral Kent said. Federation military doctrine assumes that all parties will follow established rules of engagement. Your teaching undermines that assumption. Commander Yeath, a Vorthon officer who had arrived with Kent's group, activated a holographic display showing casualty statistics from recent conflicts. For the past 2,000 years, galactic warfare has operated under agreed-upon limitations. Average casualty rates remain below 20% before negotiated surrender. Combat duration rarely exceeds 48 hours. Civilian populations are protected under ancient treaties. These protocols have prevented the kind of destructive, total warfare that plagued earlier galactic civilizations, added another officer. They allow for political resolution of conflicts without species-level devastation. Morrison studied the statistics with professional interest. Admiral, may I ask how these agreements hold up when facing enemies who don't recognize your rules? The question seemed to surprise the Federation officers. Admiral Kent frowned. What do you mean? What happens when you encounter an enemy that fights for total victory rather than limited objectives? An enemy that doesn't surrender at 20% casualties or negotiate after 48 hours, or respect treaties protecting civilians? The room fell silent. The concept was almost unimaginable to species that had evolved beyond such barbaric warfare. Carter continued the explanation. Human military history is full of such enemies. The Mongol Empire, the Nazi regime, various terrorist organizations, groups that fought for complete dominance or destruction of their opponents. Our doctrine developed in response to these threats. But surely such enemies are rare, protested Commander Yith. Morrison shook his head. Admiral, the Krillian raiders who attacked our colonies 2 years ago didn't follow your rules. They didn't negotiate surrender or respect civilian populations. They fought until we destroyed their entire raiding fleet and tracked down their base worlds. Which is why your methods succeeded against them, Admiral Kent acknowledged. But that doesn't mean these methods should be taught to other species. Zex-9 finally spoke, his 6 arms moving in patterns of deep concern. Perhaps someone could explain why human methods are fundamentally different from traditional Federation doctrine? Morrison stood and walked to the viewport, looking out at the Academy's training facilities. Commandant, it comes down to how we define victory. Most galactic species fight to achieve specific military or political objectives. Humans fight to eliminate existential threats. He turned back to face the room. When humans engage in combat, we operate under the assumption that we're fighting for the survival of our species, our culture, our way of life. Every tactical decision is made with that level of commitment, Carter added. That's why our methods seem extreme to other species. We're not just teaching tactics, we're teaching students to fight as if defeat means extinction. The implications of this statement settled over the assembled officers like a cold weight. Admiral Kent leaned back in his chair, processing what he had heard. Are you saying that humans are psychologically incapable of fighting limited wars? Morrison considered the question carefully. We're capable of it, Admiral, but we don't trust it. Every human military conflict in our history was fought with the understanding that incomplete victory could lead to future devastation. But surely this results in excessive casualties and destruction, protested Professor Lythe 6. Often, yes, Carter admitted. But human experience has taught us that excessive casualties today are preferable to total destruction tomorrow. Glow of Dawn made a sound like crystal fragments in the wind. This explains why your students fight past the point where other species would surrender. They've learned to think like humans about survival. Admiral Kent stood abruptly. That's exactly the problem. These cadets aren't humans. They're members of species that have evolved beyond the need for such desperate warfare. Teaching them human methods makes them dangerous to themselves and others. The truth hung in the air like an accusation. The Academy had inadvertently created something unprecedented in galactic history. Alien warriors who fought with human intensity, but lacked human cultural restraints. Commander Yith accessed another holographic display, showing psychological profiles of the affected cadets. Look at these evaluation results. Students who have trained under human instruction show marked changes in their threat assessment patterns, risk tolerance levels, and acceptable casualty thresholds. They're not becoming better soldiers, Admiral Kent concluded. They're becoming human soldiers. That's a fundamentally different and more dangerous thing. Morrison felt the weight of the moment settling around him. Admiral, what are you saying? I'm saying that human combat doctrine represents a clear and present danger to the psychological stability of other Federation species. Your methods are effective precisely because they abandon the moral and ethical restraints that allow civilized warfare to exist. The final part of the meeting was conducted in hushed tones, with security classifications that would last for decades. Admiral Kent outlined the decision that had already been made at the highest levels of Federation government. Human combat techniques would be removed from the Academy curriculum immediately. The official reason would be incompatibility with existing Federation military protocols. The real reason would remain classified. Morrison and Carter would be reassigned to specialized roles where their unique expertise could be utilized without exposing other species to human military psychology. The cadets who had trained under Dier then would undergo intensive psychological rehabilitation to reverse the changes in their thinking patterns. This isn't a criticism of human effectiveness, Admiral Kent explained. Your methods work precisely because they represent total commitment to victory. But that same commitment makes them psychologically toxic to species that have learned to fight for limited objectives. As the meeting concluded, Morrison asked one final question. Admiral, What happens when the Federation encounters enemies that fight like humans? Enemies that don't follow the rules and won't accept limited defeat? Admiral Kent paused at the door. Then we'll call the humans, Captain. Because sometimes the galaxy needs species that understand total war. The official records would show that the human exchange program was terminated due to curriculum incompatibilities. The real reports, buried in the deepest archives of Federation intelligence, told a different story. They documented the discovery that humans didn't just fight wars differently. They thought about violence differently. Every battle was their last battle. Every enemy was an existential threat, and every victory had to be absolute. This made them simultaneously the most valuable and most dangerous allies the Federation had ever encountered. They could win any war, but teaching their methods to others risked creating monsters that even humans couldn't control. Years later, when young alien officers asked why human combat techniques weren't taught in their academies despite proven effectiveness, instructors would simply say that human methods were too specialized for general application. The truth, that human warfare was considered too psychologically dangerous for other species to learn, remained one of the Federation's most closely guarded secrets. But in the deepest levels of Federation strategic command, human advisors were quietly consulted whenever threats emerged that refused to follow civilized rules of engagement. Because sometimes when facing